Welcome to Ebony's Storytelling. How are you doing today? I have a face mask on, and we're going to be reading the Bible. Then we are going to be reading, drum roll please, Dragon Drum. Then we are going to be ending the video.
Did you hiccup?
Nope, I didn't hiccup.
Did you tell everybody what tomorrow is?
Hi.
Oh! By the way, tomorrow's my birthday.
And you'll be?
And I'll be 10.
Yes, it's our last day with anyone in our family in single digits.
Nostalgia.
Wow. Rebecca just got sad. All right, so we just finished Hebrews. Okay, so let's go through the books in the Bible that we've read on this live stream. We've read Proverbs. We started with Proverbs. We went to John. Thank you for all the hearts. We went to John. We read Genesis. And then we read Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, which is really 4, but I'm counting it as 1. And then we went and we read Judges. The hearts were for JJ. Then we read Judges. And then we read Hebrews. And now we're going to go back to the Old Testament. And we also read Mark. Is there another Old Testament book that we read that I'm not counting? I can't think of it. No. Oh, Daniel. Daniel's the other Old Testament book that we read. Yeah. There we go. So, now we're going to switch it up and we're going to read something a little bit different. Excuse me. We are going to read the book of Psalms. However, we're not going to read 150 chapters. We're going to take it in little chunks. So the book of Psalms is separated into 5 different books within the book of Psalms. So we're going to read the first one. And we'll read at least one chapter every night. Some nights the chapters are kind of short, so maybe we'll read 2. In the case of today, we will read 2. Or we might even read 3 some nights. So, all right. So this is the book of Psalms. Psalm 1, the way of the righteous and the wicked. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water, that yield its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage, and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us burst their bonds apart, and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath, and terrify them in his fury, saying, As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree the Lord said to me, You are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's wheel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. That's the end of Psalm 2, and we will have to continue with Psalm 3 tomorrow. And at this time, Kimberly, we have a special visitor here to provide the synopsis. All right, well, here we go.
So what happened in the last chapter was, what happened was, I keep forgetting names. Forgive me. Limer? Primer. Sorry,
Menely.
I can't.
Primer. Master
Menely.
Robinson.
Primer, Master...
Robinson.
I know. Okay, so Primer, he's getting used to his new life as a drum apprentice, and so he runs this errand, and you see he goes over to the miners because they have sapphires for him to take over to the Harper Hall. So he goes over there, and then this old timer, that's what they're called. This old timer, he comes in looking for sapphires. So he kind of hides them, and then hides the cut ones in like his sock and shoe. He actually cut himself on one. But the guy, he only managed to get flawed ones, like really bad ones. And they're like, oh yeah, we haven't been getting very many today.
He was the neighborhood bully.
Yeah. So,
But he saved them.
yep. And apparently, through sheer skill, he got 8 extra pastries during lunch because he played the "Please, I'm poor"
Poor me.
card. He played the "Poor me" card. He played the "I'm sad."
I'm so depressed.
Yeah. So he got 8 extra tart
Bubbly
things.
pies.
Yeah, bubbly pies. He got 8 extra pies. So that's about it, right?
That's about it?
Yeah, and he came home with his butt hurting a ton because he's not used to riding animals. So,
Well, that was from when he and Menley went to go pick up Sewell.
right,
And then the next day he went on his own to go to the Sapphires.
right, but it was
But the next day his rear end wasn't bothering him nearly as bad, so.
it was pretty bad the first day though.
Yeah. Okay. We went and played laser tag today, and virtual reality, and I played, and I am so sore. I did things that I haven't done in years, and I will be paying for it tomorrow. So anyway, okay. Chapter 4. That day held one more event. At sunset, as Pimer was helping the apprentices bring in the miners' runners from the pasture, he heard the shrill cry of a fire lizard. Glancing up, he saw a slender body, wings back, drop with unnerving speed in his direction. The apprentice dropped to the ground, covered his head with his arms. Pimer braced his legs, but the bronze fire lizard did not come to his shoulder. Instead, Rocky spun around his head, berating him, his jewel-faceted eyes spinning violently, red and orange in anger. It took Pimer a few minutes to talk Rocky into landing on his shoulder, and even more time to soothe the little creature until his eyes calmed into tones of greeny blue. All the time the minor apprentice watched, eyes bugged out. There now, Rocky, I'm all right, but I have to stay the night here. I'm all right. You can tell mentally that you found me, can't you? That I'm all right? Rocky gave a sharp chirp that sounded so skeptical, Pimer had to laugh. Is that fire lizard yours? Asked Miner curiously as he approached Pimer, eyeing Rocky all the time. No, sir, said Pimer with such chagrin the miner smiled. This is one of Meneley's, Master Robinson's journeywoman. His name is Rocky. I help Meneley feed him mornings because she's got the 9 and they're a right handful and he knows me pretty well. I didn't think the creatures had enough sense to find people. Well, sir, I have to say it's the first time it's happened to me." And Pimer couldn't suppress the smug satisfaction he was feeling that Rocky had been able to find him. "Now that he's found you, what good will that do?" asked the miner with a revival of his skepticism. "Well, sir, he could go back to Meneley and make her understand that he's seen me, but it would be much more useful if you'd let me have a bit of hide for a message tied to his leg. He'll take it back, and they'll know exactly." The miner held up his hand admonishingly. "I'd rather nothing in script about the old-timer's visit." "Of course not, sir," replied Pimer, offended that he needed to be cautioned. A terse message was all he could scribe on the scrap of hide the miner grudgingly produced for him. The hide was so old, had been scraped so often for messages, that the ink blurred as he wrote, "Safe, delayed." Then it occurred to him to add in drum measures, "Aaron completed, emergency, old dragon." "You've a way with the little things, haven't you?" said the miner with reluctant respect as he watched Pimer tying the message on Rocky's leg. An operation the fire lizard oversaw as carefully as the miner. "Stop it! The dog is wagging his tail and hitting the stand for the camera." That was hilarious. Okay. "You've a way with the little things, haven't you?" said the miner with reluctant respect as he watched Pimer tying the message on Rocky's leg. An operation the fire lizard oversaw as carefully as the miner. "He knows he can trust me," said Pimer. "I'd say there were not many," replied the miner in such a dry tone that Pimer stared at him in surprise. No offense meant. Pimer had to concentrate just then on imagining Meneley as strongly as he could in his mind. Then, lifting his hand high, he gave a practiced flick to send Rocky into flight. "Go to Meneley, Rocky, go to Meneley." He and the miner watched until the fire lizard seemed to disappear in the dimming light to the east. Then the apprentice called them to their meal. As he ate, Pimer wondered what the miner had meant by that remark. Not many that fire lizards could trust? Not many people that trusted Pimer? Why would the miner say a thing like that? Hadn't he saved the miner's sapphires for them? It wasn't as if he'd told any lies to do so. Further, he'd never taken any real advantage of his friends in bargaining at a gather or failing to keep a promise. All of his friends came to him for help and shells. Wasn't the Master Harper entrusting him with this errand? And knowing about Harper Hall secrets? What had the miner meant? "Pimer!" Someone shook him by the shoulder. Abruptly, the young Harper realized that he'd been addressed several times. "You're a Harper. Can you not give us a song?" The eagerness of the request from men isolated for long periods of time in a lonely hold gave Pimer a genuine pang of regret. "Sirs, the reason I'm messaging is that my voice is changing, and I'm not allowed to sing just now. But," he added, seeing the intense disappointment on every face, "that doesn't mean I can't talk them to you, if you've something I can drum to give the rhythm." After several attempts, he found a saucepan that did not sound too flat, and while the men stomped their heavy boots in time, he talked the newest songs from the Harper Hall, even giving them Domic's new song about Lessa. The shell knew when they'd hear it sung, though no one was supposed to hear it until Lord Grove's feast. If the performance of the spoken song lacked much in Pimer's estimation, Master Shanagar couldn't hear. Domic would never know, and the men were so grateful that he felt completely justified. He left the mine hold with the first rays of the sun, and made the trip back to the Harper Hall at a downhill pace that all but forced his voice back up into his treble range. At times his runners slithered unnervingly down tracks that they had laboriously climbed the day before. Pimer closed his eyes, held tightly to the saddle pad, and fervently hoped not to go sailing off the track into the deep gorges. When he returned the stolid runner to Bannock, it was barely sweated under the midstrap, while Pimer knew that his armpits and back were damp with perspiration. "Safe back, I see," was Bannock's only remark. "He may be slow, but he's sure-footed," said Pimer with such exaggerated relief that Bannock laughed. As Pimer jogged into the Harper Hall court, he heard Tilgan bravely singing his first solo as Lessa. Pimer grinned to himself, for Tilgan's voice sounded tired, even if it was note-wise. None of Meneley's fare was sunning on the ridge, but Zare was sprawled on the ledge of the Harper's window, so Pimer took the steps two at a time. While he sort of wished someone would encounter him on his triumphant return, he was also relieved that he'd have no temptation to blurt out his adventures. Master Robinton's greeting, however, was warm enough to make Pimer's puff his chest out in pride. You make the most of your opportunities, young Pimer, but kindly explain your cryptic messages before I burst with curiosity. Old dragon? Does mean old-timers, I take it. Yes, sir, said, and Pimer took the seat the harper indicated and began. Taran and Fidranth, with 2 blue dragons, came to relieve the miner of his sapphires. You're positive beyond doubt that it was Taran and Fidranth? Positive. I did see them once or twice before they were exiled. Besides, the miner knew them all too well. The harper gestured for him to continue, and the day's events made good telling with the best of all audiences in the master harper, who listened intently without a single interruption. He then asked Pimer to repeat, this time questioning a detail here, a response there, and extracting from Pimer every nuance of the confrontation of miner and old-timer. He laughed appreciatively at Pimer's strategy and lauded his caution for putting the 4 cut gems in his boots. It was only then that Pimer remembered to hand the precious stones to the harper. The sun sparkled off the facets as the sapphires lay on the table. I'll have a word with Master Nikat myself, and I think I'll see him today, said Robinton, holding up one of the gems between thumb and forefinger and squinting at it in the sunlight. Beautiful workmanship, not a flaw. That's what the miner said, and then Pimer daringly added, I gather it's not easy to find the right blues for Master Harpers. Master Robinton regarded Pimer, a startled expression on his face, which changed to amusement. You will keep that to yourself as well, young man. Pimer nodded solemnly. Of course. If I'd had a fire lizard of my own, you wouldn't have to have had worried about me and the stones, and perhaps something could be done with Taran. The harper's face altered, and the flash in his eyes had nothing to do with amusement. Now Pimer couldn't imagine what had prompted him to say such a thing. He didn't even dare look away from the harper's severe gaze, although he wanted more than anything else to creep away and hide from his master's disapproval. He did stiffen, fully expecting a blow for such impertinence. When you can keep your wits about you as you did yesterday, Pimer, said Master Robinton after an interminable interval, you prove Meneley's good opinion of your potential. You have also just proved the main criticism that hall masters have expressed. I do not disapprove of ambition, nor the ability to think independently, but, and suddenly his voice lost the cold displeasure, presumption is unforgivable. Presuming to criticize a dragon rider is the most dangerous offense against discretion. Further, and the harper's finger was raised in warning, you are rushing towards a privilege you have by no means earned. Now, off with you to Master Oldkey and learn the proper drum measure for old-timer. The kindly note of his tone was almost too much for Pimer, who could more easily have borne blows and a tirade for his transgressions. He made his way to the door as fast as his leaden legs could carry him. Pimer! Master Robinton's voice checked him as he fumbled for the latch. You did handle yourself very well at the mine-hold, only do, and the harper sounded as resigned as Master Shanagar often had, do please try to guard your quick tongue. Oh, sir, I'll try as hard as I can, really I will, his voice cracked ignominiously, and he spun around the door so that the harper wouldn't see the tears of shame and relief in his eyes. He stood for a moment in the quiet hall, intensely grateful that it was empty at this time of day, as he conquered dismay at his untimely insolence. The harper was so right. He had to learn to think before he spoke. Nobody here has that problem. He never should have blurted out that unfortunate criticism of dragon riders. He'd have rated a right sound beating from any other master. Dominic wouldn't have hesitated a moment, nor even languid Master Shanagar, whose hand he'd felt many a time for his brashness. But how had he dared criticize dragon riders, even old-timers, to Master Robinton? Certainly that took the prize for impudence, even from him. Pimer shivered and vowed fervently to mind his thoughts, and even more carefully his tongue, particularly now when he did know something of real significance, for he had been aware previously to his imprudent comment that the appearance of the old-timers at the mine, not to mention their errand, was unwelcome news to the harper. Besides, what could have been done about the old-timers' illegal return to the north? Pimer gave his own ear a clout that made his eyes swim and then started down the corridor. Now, how was he to find out the drum code for old-timers? Under the circumstances, he couldn't just ask Durzin outright without having to explain why he needed to know. Nor could he ask one of the other apprentices. They were annoyed enough with him and his quick studying. There'd be a way, he was sure. Then he wondered why Master Robinson had asked him to find out. Was it a code he'd need? Did that mean that the Harper expected this wouldn't be the first such visit by the old-timers, or what? The speculations on this subject occupied Pimer's mind off and on for the next few days until he did have the chance to check the code. Somewhat to Pimer's disgust, Durzin treated him as he had deliberately protracted his errand to avoid polishing the drums. This was his first task, and because Pimer couldn't polish when the drums were in use, it dragged on until midday. That afternoon, Pimer began to participate in another activity of the drum height, since he had unfortunately learned the drum measures so well. All apprentices were supposed to stop and listen when messages came in and write down what they heard, if they could. Then Durzin checked their interpretations of the message. It seemed harmless enough, but Pimer soon learned that it was one more road of trouble for him. All drum messages were considered private information, a bit silly to Pimer's way of thinking, since most journeymen and all masters had to be adept in drum messages. A full third of the Harper Hall would understand most of a drum message booming across the valley. Nonetheless, if word of something especially sensitive became common knowledge about the hall, it was deemed the fault of a gossipy drum apprentice. Pimer was twigged for that role now. When Durzin first accused him of loose talk a day or two after he started writing messages, he stared in utter astonishment at the journeyman, and got a hard clout across the head for it. "Don't try your ways on me, Pimer. I'm well aware of your tricks." "But, sir, I'm only in the hall at mealtimes, and sometimes not even then." "Don't answer back." "But, sir—" Durzin fetched him another clout, and Pimer nursed his grievance in silence, rapidly trying to figure out which of the other apprentices was making mischief for him. Probably Clell. And how was he going to stop it? He certainly didn't want Master Robinson to hear such a wretched lie. 2 days later, a rather urgent message for Master Oldive was drummed through from Nebal. As Pimer was on duty, he was dispatched with it to the healer. Mindful of a possible repeat accusation, Pimer noted that no one was about in court or hall as he delivered his message. Master Oldive bade him wait for a reply, which he wrote on a then carefully folded sheet. Pimer raced across the empty court, up the stairs to the drum heights, and arrived out of breath, shoving the note into Durzin's hand. There, still in its original folds. "I met no one coming or going." Durzin stared at Pimer, his scowl deepening. "You're being insolent again." He raised his hand. Pimer stepped back deliberately, caught sight of the other apprentices watching the scene with great interest. The especially eager glint in Clell's eyes confirmed Pimer's suspicion. "No, I'm trying to prove to you that I'm no blabbermouth, even if I did understand that message. Lord Mirren of Nebal is ill and requires Master Oldive urgently. But who'd care if he died after what he's done to Pern?" Pimer knew he'd merited Durzin's blow then and didn't duck. "You'll learn to keep a civil tongue in your head, Pimer, or it's back to the runner hold for you." "I've a right to defend my honor, and I can." Pimer caught himself just in time before he blurted out that Master Robinson could attest to his discretion. Rife with rumor, as the Harper Hall generally was, there hadn't been a whisper about the old-timers' raid on the mine. How? Durzin's single derisive word told Pimer forcibly how very difficult that would be without being rightfully accused of indiscretion. "I'll figure a way, you'll see." Pimer glared impotently at the delighted grins of the other apprentices. That night, when everyone else slept through the dead hours, Pimer lay awake, restless with agitation. The more he examined his problem, the harder it was to solve it without being indiscreet or on some count or another. When he'd still been free to chatter with his friends, he could have asked the help of Brawley, Bonds, Timney, and Randley. Among them, they'd surely have been able to discover a solution. If he approached Meneley or Siebel about such a piffling problem, they might decide he wasn't the right lad for their needs. They might even consider his complaint a lack of discretion in itself. How right Master Robinson had been when he said that Pimer might possibly be plagued into disclosing matters best left unmentioned. Only how could the Harper have known that Pimer was stuck in the one discipline as a drum apprentice where he was likely to be accused of indiscretions? One possibility presented itself to his questioning mind. The apprentices, even Clell as the oldest, were still plodding through the medium-hard drum measures. Therefore, some parts of every long message reaching the Harper Hall were incomprehensible to them. Now, if Pimer learned drum language beat perfect, he'd understand the messages in full. Not that he'd let Durzin know that when he wrote the message down for him, but he'd keep a private record of everything he translated. Then, the next time there was a rumor of a half-understood message, Pimer would prove to Durzin that he had known all the message, not just the parts and the other apprentices had understood. To further achieve his end, Pimer kept to the drum heights even at mealtimes, preferably within the sight of Durzin, the master, or one of the other duty journeymen. If he wasn't near others, he couldn't be accused of gossiping to them. Even when he was sent on message runs, he made the return trips so fast no one could possibly accuse him of dawdling and gossiping on the way. The only other time he was in the court was to help mentally feed the fire lizards. Messages came through, some of them urgent, some tempting enough. Pimer would have thought for one of the apprentices to repeat, but no whisper of rumor repaid his immolation. In despair, he gave up his plan and tore up the messages he had written, but he still held himself away from others. He wasn't certain how much more of this he could endure when Meneley appeared in the drum heights just after breakfast one morning. "I need a messenger today," she said to Durzin. Clell would, "No, I want Pimer. Now Meneley, I wouldn't mind letting him go for a minor errand, but Pimer is Master Robinton's choice," she said with a shrug, and he's cleared with Master Oldkey. Pimer, get your gear together." Pimer blandly ignored the black looks Clell directed in his way as he crossed the living room. "Meneley, I think you ought to mention to Master Robinton that we haven't found Pimer too reliable." Pimer unreliable? Pimer had been about to whip round and defy Durzin, but the amused condescension in Meneley's tone was a far better defense than any he could muster under his circumstances. In one mild question, Meneley had given Durzin, not to mention Clell and the others, a lot to think about. "Oh, he's been bleeding to you, has he?" Pimer could hear the sneer in the journeyman's voice. He took a deep breath and continued to gather his things. "In point of fact," and now Meneley sounded puzzled, "he's not been talkative at all, apart from commenting on the weather and the condition of my fire lizards. Should he have reason to bleat, Durzin?" Pimer half ran back into the room to forestall any explanation by the journeyman. This opportunity was playing beautifully into his hands. "I'm ready to go, Meneley." "Yes, and we have to move fast." It was obvious to Pimer that Meneley had wanted to hear Durzin's reply. "I'll be back to you on this, Durzin. Come on, Pimer." Second. Yeah. You need to wash your face now. Come here. Yep.
Your face is dry now.
Ask Becca to help you wash that off of your face in my bathroom. Okay.
Becca.
She led the way down the steps at a clatter, and only when they had passed the first landing did she turn to him. "What have you been up to, Pimer?" "I haven't been up to anything," he replied with such vehemence that Meneley grinned at him. "That's the trouble. Your reputation's caught up with you. More than that, it's being used against me." As much as Pimer wanted to expand, the less he said, he decided, even to Meneley, the stronger his position. "The other apprentices against you?" "Yes, I saw their expressions. What did you do to set them so?" "Learn drum measures too fast is all I can think of." "You sure?" "I'm bloody sure, Meneley. Do you think I'd do anything to get in the Master Harper's bad record?" "No," she said thoughtfully as they skipped down the last flight. "No, you wouldn't. Look, we'll sort it all out when we come back. There's a gather today at Eigenhold. Siebel and I are going to be there as Harpers, but Master Robinton wants you to play scruffy boy apprentice." "Can I ask why?" Pimer delivered the question on the end of a long, suffering sigh. Meneley laughed and reached out to ruffle his hair. "You can, but I've no answer. We weren't told either. He just wants you to wander about and gather and listen." "Has he got old-timers on his mind?" Pimer asked as casually as he could. "I'd say he probably does," Meneley answered after a thoughtful moment. "He's been worried. I may be his journeywoman, but I don't always know what's on his mind. Neither does Siebel." They had reached the archway now and turned towards the gathered meadow. "I'm to ride a dragon?" asked Pimer. He lurched to a stop, his eyes bunging out at the scene before him. Bronze Leoth was shaking his wings out in the sun, his great jeweled eyes gleaming blue-green as he turned his head to watch the antics of the fire lizards. Dwarfed by the bulk, the tall figures of Natan, Fort Weir leader, and Siebel stood by his shoulder. "Come on, Pimer, we mustn't keep them waiting. The gather at Eigen is already well started." Pimer struggled into his weirhide jacket, making that an excuse for falling behind mentally. Actually, he was both terrified and overjoyed at the prospect of riding a dragon. All those cloddies up there in the drum heights, he hoped that they were watching, that they'd see him riding off on a dragon. That'd teach them to smear his reputation. He pushed from his mind the corollary that the privilege of flying a dragonback would make his lot with his fellow apprentices that much harder. What mattered was that now Pimer was going to ride a dragon. Natan had always been Pimer's ideal of a dragon rider, tall, with a really broad set of shoulders, dark brown hair slightly curled from being confined under a riding helmet, an easy, confident air reflected by a direct gaze and a ready smile. The contrast between this present Fort Weir leader and his disgruntled predecessor, Turon, was more vividly apparent as Natan smilingly greeted the Harper's apprentice. "Sorry your voice changed, Pimer. I'd been looking forward to Lord Grove's gather and that new saga I've heard so much about from Meneley. Have you ridden dragonback before, Pimer?" "No? Well, up with you, Meneley. Show Pimer the knack." As Pimer attentively watched Meneley grab the riding strap and half walk up Lyath's shoulder, swing her leg agilely over the last neck ridge, he still couldn't believe his good fortune. He could just imagine Turon permitting a journeyman, much less an apprentice lad, to ride his bronze. "See how it was done? Good. Up with you then, Pimer." Siebel gave him an initial boost, and Meneley leaned over with a helping hand and a guide rope. It seemed a long way up a dragon's shoulder. Pimer grabbed the rope, and just as he planted his booted foot on Lyath's shoulder, he wondered if he'd hurt the dragon's smooth hide. Natan laughed. "No, you won't hurt Lyath with your boots, but he thanks you for worrying." Pimer was so startled that he almost lost his grip. "Reach up, Pimer," Meneley ordered. "I didn't know he'd hear me," he said in a gasp as he settled astride Lyath's neck. "Dragons hear what they choose to," she said, grinning. "Sit back against me. Siebel's got to fit in front of you." The words were barely out of her mouth before Siebel had swung up with the ease of considerable practice and settled himself before Pimer. Natan followed, passing back the riding straps. Pimer thought that a needless caution. His legs were wedged so tightly between Meneley and Siebel's he couldn't have moved if he had to. Then Siebel peered over his shoulder at him. "You'll have heard a lot about between, I expect, but I'll warn you now, it's scary even when you know what to expect." "Right, Pimer," Meneley added, circling his waist with her arms. "I've got you tight, and you hang on to Siebel's belt." "You won't feel once we're between," Siebel continued. "There's nothing between except cold. You won't be able to feel Lyath beneath your legs, nor our legs against yours, nor your hands about my belt. But the sensation lasts only a few heartbeats. They'll sound very loud to you. Just count 'em. We'll be doing the same thing, I assure you." Siebel's grin absolved Pimer from any expression of fear or doubt. Pimer nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He didn't care what happened between. At least he would have experienced it, which very few apprentice harpers could say. Suddenly there was a great heave, and he cracked his chin against Siebel's shoulder blade, inadvertently looking down. He saw the ground moving away from him as Lyath sprang skyward. He could feel the great muscles along Lyath's neck as the fragile seeming wings took their first all-important downsweep. Then the gather meadow and the Harper Hall seemed to rush away, and they were on a level with the Hold fire heights. Siebel gave Pimer's hands, clutching his belt, a warning squeeze. The next heartbeat, and there was nothing but a cold so intense that it was pain, except that Pimer couldn't feel pain with his body, only sensed that his lack of tactile contact was reality included everything except the wild beating of his heart against his ribcage. Ruthlessly he clamped down on his instinct to scream. Then they were back in the world again, Lyath gliding effortlessly down to the right, a tremendous expanse of golden ground beneath his wings. Pimer shuddered again and kept his eyes fixed on Siebel's shoulders. Hard as Pimer wished he wouldn't, Leoth continued to glide downward, dipping sideways at unnerving angles. Suddenly, Pimer could hear fire lizards chittering, and despite his resolve not to look around, he found himself watching them zip about the dragon. "It is scary to look down," Meneley's voice said in his ear. "It's worse when they—" Pimer felt his stomach drop, and to his horror, his seat seemed to leave the dragon's neck. He gasped.
Hi, I'm back.
He gasped and clutched more tightly at Siebel, feeling the man's diaphragm muscles move as he chuckled. "That's what I meant," said Meneley. "Natan says it's only air currents pushing the dragons up or letting them down." "Oh, is that all?" Pimer managed to get the words out in a rush, but his voice betrayed him. All came out in a 2-octave crack. Manley didn't laugh, and he felt more kindly toward her than any other time as in their association. "It always scares me," she said in a comforting shout by his left ear. He was just getting accustomed to this additional hazard of flying dragonback when Leoth seemed to be diving straight for the Eigen River bed. He was pressed back against Meneley and didn't know whether to clutch more fiercely at Siebel's belt or relax into the pressure. "Don't forget to breathe," Meneley was shouting, and at that he barely heard her words as the wind ripped sound away. Then Leoth leveled and began to circle at a gentler rate of descent towards the now visible rectangle of the gather. To the left was the river, a broad muddy stream between red sandstone banks. Small sailing craft skimmed the surface on a current that must be swifter than the turgid surface suggested. To the right was the broad, clean-swept rock shelf that led up to Eigenhold, a safe distance above the highest flood marks left by the river on the sandstone banks. Behind Eigenhold rose curious, wing-fashioned cliffs, some of which made additional holds for Eigen's people, for there were no rows of cot-holds adjoining the main hold here. Eigenhold also had no fire heights, no needing any since there was nothing but sand and stone around the hold proper, to which thread could do no harm. The lands that supplied Eigenhold were around the next bend of the river, where the waters had been led inland by canals to supply water-grain fields. Pimer wasn't sure that he would like living in such a barren-looking hold, even if no thread could ever attack it, and it was hot. Red dust puffed up as Leoth landed, and suddenly Pimer was unbearably warm. He began to unbelt his wear-high jacket before he released the riding strap and noticed that Meneley was as quick to strip helmets, gloves, and jacket. "I always forget how hot it is in Eigen," she said, fluffing out her hair. "The dragons love it," said Natan, pointing beyond the hold to where the rough shapes that Pimer had assumed were rock now became recognizable as dragons, stretched out to bake in the sun. It was as he was sliding down Leoth's shoulder that Pimer noticed the curious construction of the gather rectangle. There didn't seem to be a walkway. The only open space was the customary central square for dancing, though who'd have the energy to dance in this heat he didn't know. Then Pimer ducked while Leoth showered them all with sand as he vaulted into the air and winged to join the other sunbathing dragons. The fire lizards, Natan, Triss, Siebel's Kimmy, and Meneley's 9, swirled up and away and were met mid-air by other fire lizards, the augmented fair swirling higher and higher in the joy of meeting. "That'll occupy them for a while," said Meneley, and then she turned to Pimer. "Give me your flying gear, and I'll leave it at the hold till you need it again. We must pay our respects to Lord Lottie and the others," said Siebel, bringing out a handful of marks from his pocket. He presented Pimer with an 8-piece and 2 30-seconds. "I'm not being stingy, Pimer, but you'd be questioned if you had too many marks about you, and I don't think Eigenhold runs to bubbly pies." "Too hot to eat 'em anyway." Pimer mopped his sweaty forehead with one hand as he gratefully slid the marks into his pouch. But they do make confection of fruits that you might like," said Siebel. "Anyway, move around and listen. Don't get caught being nosy, and come up to the hold for the evening meal. Ask the Harper Banter if you have any trouble on DC. He remembers you." Stuffy. Okay. They reached the edge of the gather tents, and now Pimer realized that walking space existed, but was considerately covered with tenting to deflect the worst of the sun's baking heat. We have a lot more pages to go. It was simple now for Pimer to move away from the journeyman harpers and the weir leader in the steady flow of people sauntering past the gather stalls. He saw mentally turn about, trying to see where he had got to. Then Sibyl spoke to her, and she shrugged and moved on with him. Almost immediately, Pimer noticed one great difference between this and the gathers he had attended in the West. People took their time. In order to separate himself from his craftmates, Pimer had deliberately lagged behind, but when he would have stepped out again at his customary pace, he hesitated. No one was moving briskly at all. Gestures and voices were languid, smiles slow, and even laughter had a lazy fall. A great many people carried long tubes from which they sipped. Stalls dispensing drinks, chilled water, as well as sliced fruits were frequently placed and well patronized. About every 10 stalls or so, there were areas where people lounged, either on the sand or on the benches placed about the edges. The tenting was raised in corners to catch breezes sweeping up from the river, cooling the lounging areas and the walkway. Pimer did one complete walkabout of the gather rectangle. He could appreciate that, despite breezeways and the expenditure of the minimum of physical effort, people did not do much talking as they strolled from stall to stall. The talking, either conversation or bartering, was done well while both parties sat comfortably, so he used one 30-second piece on a long tube of fruit juice and some succulent slices of a rind melon, found himself an inconspicuous spot in one lounge area, and settled to listen as he sipped his drink and ate. At first he didn't quite catch the softer drawl of these southeasterners. The low-pitched conversation between two men on his left turned out to be the innocuous boasting of one about the breeding lines of the splay-footed runners he was hoping to barter profitably, while the other man kept extolling the virtues of the currently favored strain. Disgusted at such a waste of his time, Pimer focused on his ears on the group of 5 men on his right. They were blaming the weather on thread, and bad crops on the weather, and everything else except their lack of industry, which Pimer thought would be the real problem. A group of women were also murmuring against the weather, their mates, their children, and the nuisancey children of other holds, but all in fairly comfortable, tolerant, amused fashion. 3 men, with their heads so close together no sound passed their shoulders, finally parted, but not before Pimer saw a small sack pass from one to another and decided that they must only have been bargaining hard. The runnermen left, and a new pair took their places, composed their loose robes about them, leaned back, and promptly went to sleep. Pimer found himself growing more heavy-eyed and sipped the last of his juice to keep him awake, wondering if he would find another lounge area as dull. The combination of excited voices and a chill breeze woke him. He stared about, wondering if he had missed a drum message, and then oriented himself. Night had fallen, and, with the set of the sun, the cooler winds of evening blew cheerfully through the raised flaps. There was no one else in the tent with him, but he could smell the aroma of roasting meats and scrambled to his feet. He'd be late at the hold for his supper, and he was hungry. Cool evening had enlivened everyone, for the walkway was now full of quickly stepping, chattering people, and Pimer had to duck and dart his way out of the gather tents. The dragon lumps on the hold cliff turned their brilliant lanterns of eyes on the doings below them, rivaling the blazing glow baskets set on high standards about the gather grounds. No one challenged Pimer at the hold courtyard gates, and he found the main hall by simply following the general drift of the well-dressed people. Lord Lottie, according to Harper Hall gossip, was not a very outgoing man, but at a gather every holder did make an effort. The principal men and craftmasters of his hold were invited with their immediate families to dine in the hold hall, as well as such dragon riders and visiting lord holders, craftmasters, and masters who might be attending the gather. By custom, the harpers ate at the first table below the main one. Pimer had never seen the resident harper, Bantur, and hoped that in high spirits with DC, who'd been seconded to Bantur the night mentally had walked the tables to become a journeyman woman, and with Strud, who'd been posted to a sea-hold on Eigen River that same night. Gray of hair, but with bright and unusually blue eyes, Banter welcomed Pimer with such friendliness for a mere apprentice that Pimer was made more uncomfortable by kindness than he would have been by truciturnity. I have no idea. Taciturnity. I know what that means. Okay. Banter insisted on getting him fresh meats and tubers from one of the drudges, and heaped his plate so high with choice cuts that Pimer's eyes goggled. The other harpers talked while he ate, and when he had finally swallowed the last morsel, Banter suggested they all leave to make room for more of Lord Lottie's guests. Then Banter asked if Pimer would take a harper's turn on drum or guitar, and when Pimer saw Siebel's discreet nod, he agreed with a show of enthusiasm to take a guitar part. "Why, Pimer, I thought sure you'd take a drum part," said Meneley, her expression so bland that he nearly rose to her bait. Pimer restrained an urge to kick her in the shins, and smiled sweetly at her instead. "You heard today what the drummers think of me," he replied so demurely that Meneley chortled until her eyes filled. As the harpers filed out of the hall for the gather, Siebel fell in step with Pimer. "Heard anything of interest?" "Who talks during the day's heat?" asked Pimer with heartfelt disgust. He suspected that Siebel had known about desert daytime indolence. "You'll notice the change in them now, and you'll only need to do the dance turns, if I gauge the gather right," said Siebel, glancing ahead at Meneley's slender figure in harper blue. "They'll keep her singing until she's hoarse. They always do." Pimer glanced swiftly at Siebel, wondering if the journeyman was aware of showing his feelings for the harper girls so openly. The first dance turn was the longest and the most energetic. The crisp night air stimulated the dancers' gyrations until they were energetic beyond Pimer's credence. Quite a transformation from the languid manners of the afternoon. Then, as Banter, Deasy, Strud, and Meneley remained on the platform to sing, Siebel nodded to Pimer to work his way from the square's attentive audience towards the smaller groups of men drinking tubes in hand, conversations in quiet tones. The subdued level, Pimer decided, was out of courtesy to the singers and their audience, but it made it hard for him. He was about to give up when the word old-timers caught his ear. He sidled closer to the group, and in the light of the glow baskets, recognized two as sea-holders, a miner, a smith, and an eigenholder. "I don't say it was them, but since they've gone south, we've had no more unexpected demands," said the smith. "Gnarsh may also be an old-timer, but he follows Benden's ways, so it had to have been old-timers. Young Toric often sends his two-master north for trade," said one of the sea-holders in a voice so confidential that Pimer had to strain to catch the words. "He always has, and my holder sees no harm in it. Toric's no dragon man, and those that stayed south with him don't fall under Benden's orders, so we trade. He may bargain close, but he pays well." "In marks?" asked the eigenholder, surprised. "No, barter, gemstones, hides, fruit, such like, and once—" Here Pimer held his breath for the fear of missing the confidential whisper. 9 fire lizard eggs. "No!" Envy as well as surprised interest were expressed in that startled reply. The sea-holder quickly gestured the man to keep his tone down. "Of course," and there was no disguising the bitter jealousy. "They've all the sand beaches in the world to search in the south. Any chance—" The fascinating conversation broke off as another sea-holder joined them, an older man, and possibly superior to the gossiping seaman, for talk turned to other things and Pimer moved on. Then Meneley began to sing alone, the other harpers accompanying her. All conversations died as she sang, with what appeared to Pimer to be incredible aptness, the fire lizard song. Her voice was richer now, Pimer noticed with a critical ear, the tone better sustained. He couldn't fault her musical phrasing, nor should he be able to after 3 turns of severe instruction by Master Shonagar. Her voice was so admirably suited to the songs she sang, he thought, and more expressive than many singers who had ever been natural voices. As often as Pimer had learned the fire lizard song, he found himself listening as intently as ever. When the song ended, he applauded as vigorously as everyone else, only then aware that he had been equally captivated. Putting words to music was not Meneley's only talent. She put her music in the hearts and minds of her listeners, too. While her enrapt audience started shouting for their favorite tunes, she beckoned Siebel to the platform, and they sang a duet of an Eastern sea-hold song, their voices so well blended that Pimer's respect and admiration for his fellow harpers reached unprecedented heights. Now, if only his voice turned tenor, he might have the chance to sing with. He played 3 more dance turns, but Sibyl had been correct. The Eigen gatherers wanted Meneley whenever she would favor them with song. Pimer also noticed that for every solo she sang there was at least one group song and a duet, including the Eigen harpers. Clever of her to forestall ill feeling. Too bad such discretion did not translate into his particular problem with the drum apprentices. Whether it was because he'd had a sleep in the afternoon or because the desert air was particularly bracing, Pimer was never sure, but it was only when he noticed the thinning of the crowd around the dance area and the increased number of people rolled up in their blankets in the gathered tents that he began to feel fatigue. He looked around then for Sibyl and Meneley. When he saw nothing of them, he finally sought a weary, yawning Strud, who advised him with a grin to find a corner and get some sleep if he could. It had been easy enough to sleep that afternoon, but now, with no heat to lull him, the things he had heard, music as well as malice, danced about in his mind when positive fact emerged. The old-timers' descent on the miner in Fort Hold was not an isolated incident. He also knew that while Gunnarish, Eigen's old-time weir leader, was respected, Eigen holders would have given much to be beholden to Bendon instead. A sharp peck on his ear woke him, and he had a momentary fright before he focused his eyes on Rocky's cocked head and heard the reassuring soft chirrup. Someone was snoring lustily beside him, and Pimer's back was warm. He cautiously eased away from this unknown sleeper. Rocky chirped again, and hopping off his shoulder, walked a few paces away with exaggerated steps before looking back at Pimer. He wanted Pimer to come with him, and while his eyes were not red with hunger, they were whirling fast enough to indicate some urgency. "I don't need a drum to get your message," Pimer said under his breath as he moved further away from his snoring bed companion. He really must have been tired to sleep through that sort of racket. Rocky landed on his right shoulder, poking at his cheek to force his head left. Pimer obediently ducked under the tent flap, and in the glows that were shedding a subdued, waning light on the sands before Eigenhold, he saw the dark bulk of a dragon and several figures. Rocky called in a sweet, light voice and then took off towards the group. Pimer followed, yawning and shivering in the chill pre-dawn breeze, wishing he had some claw, especially if the presence of a dragon meant he had to go between. He was cold enough already. The dragon was not Leoth, as he'd half expected, but a brown nearly as big as the Fort Weir dragon. It had to be Canth, and it was, for as he neared the group, he saw the scars on Fenor's face from the dreadful, near-fatal scoring he'd taken on his famous jump to the Red Star. "Come on, Pimer," called Sibyl. "Fenor's here to take us to Bendon Weir. Ramoth's last clutch is hatching." Oh. Pimer started to whoop with joy, then bit his tongue, choking off his jubilation. Bad enough he'd been to a gather, but when Clell and that lot heard he'd been to a Bendon hatching, his life wouldn't be worth a wax mark. He saw in the same instant that the others were expecting him to react with appropriate anticipation, and, loudly damning his changing voice, he affected as genuine a smile as he could manage. The groan that escaped him as he climbed to Canth's back was for the inexorable forces he couldn't resist rather than the physical effort. He endured in silence Sibyl's teasing about the miseries of his apprentice's life, and then mentally for his silence, which she attributed to either hunger or sleepiness. "Never mind, Pimer," she said with an encouraging smile. "There's bound to be some claw left in the pot for you at Bendon Weir." She peered down at his face. You are awake, aren't you?" "Sort of," he said, yawning again, then added for her benefit, "I just can't take it that me, Pimer, gets to go to Bendon Weir hatching." Should he ask Meneley not to tell the drum master and Durza? Could he ask her to say he'd been left at Eigenhold until they could collect him? No, he couldn't, because she'd want to know why, and he couldn't tell her because that would mark him a blubber baby bleeder, blabbermouth. There had to be some way he could settle Clell and Durzan himself. Despite his misgivings, Pimer succumbed to the fear-charged thrill of Kant's initial vault into the air, the sensation of being pressed down, the breathlessness as the huge wings beat powerfully, and he felt the effort of Kant's neck muscles under his buttocks. It wasn't quite as scary flying in the pre-dawn darkness, because he didn't know how far he was above the ground, particularly since his face was turned away from Eigen Hold's fading lights. But he caught his breath in a spurt of pure terror as Fëanor gave Kant the audible request to take them between to Bend and Weir. He was again alone in the intense, sense-deprived, utter cold, and then, before the cold could sink into his bones, they had emerged into the brightening day, momentarily suspended above the massive bowl of Bend and Weir. He'd been to Fort Weir once by cart with a group of harpers. Then Ludith, the Weir queen, had her first queen egg hatching. He'd thought that Fort was huge, but Bendon seemed much bigger. Perhaps because he was seeing it from Dragonback, perhaps because of the light touching of the far edges of the bowl, gilding the lake. Perhaps it was because this was Bendon, and Bendon figured so hugely and importantly in his eyes, and the eyes of everyone else on Pern. Without Bendon and her courageous leaders, Pern might have been half destroyed by Thread. Another dragon appeared in the air just above them, and indistinctly Pimer ducked, hearing Meneley's laugh at his reflex. A third and then a fourth dragon arrived, even as Kant began to glide down to the bowl floor. By the time Pimer could slide from the Brown's shoulder to the ground, he marveled that the dragons hadn't collided midair, appearing as they had with such startling frequency. Beauty, Kimmy, Rocky, and Diver popped in above Meneley's head, caroling with excitement, and suddenly they were joined by 5 other fire lizards Pimer had never seen before. Oh my, this goes on forever. When Meneley muttered worriedly about feeding fire lizards before they disrupted the Weir, Fëanor laughingly told them to find Miriam. She was likely to be supervising breakfast in the kitchen caverns. Siebel's nudge in his ribs reminded Pimer to thank the Brown Rider and his dragons. Then the three harpers made their way across the bowl to the brightly lit cavern. The enticing aromas of fresh claw and toasted cereals quickened their steps, Meneley leading the way towards the smallest heart. Hey, we don't put essential oils on the wall. Hello, I'm a mom. We don't put essential oils on the wall.
Okay.
You'll damage the drywall. I need a second. Oh my gosh. Okay, I know that I didn't skip the beginning of a chapter, but this chapter, hold on. Yeah, I didn't skip it. Okay, it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 whole pages in it. What time is it? It is 9:40.
Yeah, let's just stop here and then.
We're going to stop here because we've stopped.
Yeah.
And this is a good place to stop. And we will attempt to read 15 pages. Possibly not tomorrow because it's this big boy's birthday.
Yeah.
But maybe. We'll see.
This big boy's birthday.
And we'll try to read 15 pages at another time. Or we might just read 7 and then 7. We'll see.
It's my
because this
birthday
is how much
tomorrow's
of the book we have left.
Today's
Anyway,
almost up.
I know.
This much.
No, that much.
That much.
Yeah,
That much left.
So we'll stop for tonight, and
Just a little bit left.
yeah.
How many chapters have we done?
We're on chapter 4. We're halfway through chapter 4 because I'm pretty sure I've read at least 15 pages. We'll pick this back up probably Friday, possibly tomorrow. It just depends on how things go. And anyway, this is me saying goodnight. Heavy D, did you want to say goodnight? He's resting. Okay. Anyway, good night, everybody.